Hello everyone, TLSG here, back again with another daily Marvel Snap video. So today we have a new update, a new patch, we have new balance notes, several things that have been updated. It has been so very long since we have had a patch. The last one that we had was August 9th, well overdue. And this is a very welcomed patch. So a lot of the changes are pretty good. Some are pretty drastic, but I think overall it's going to make a lot of changes for the better, especially some of the general updates. And so that's what I wanted to start with. So with the patch, they added emotes. So now instead of being able to say things like snap, hello, thumbs up, you're going to be able to do emotes as well. And so overall, it reminds me a lot of maybe Clash Royale, where you can do the kind of emojis where, you know, the king is frustrated, the king is laughing. It reminds me a lot of that. And I think overall, it's a pretty cool change. I really like how they kind of fit in. So the Spider-Mans pointing at each other is always going to be hilarious. I think that's always going to be my favorite. And then you have the thumbs up. You have a lot of cool emojis, and I think it adds a little bit of variety to the player-to-player interaction. And so then the next one is the matchmaking system, which I think this is huge. So the matchmaking system will now allow for longer wait times for high-ranked players to increase the likelihood of finding a more competitive opponent. This should feel good all across the ladder. So a lot of times people that were Infinite Plus were matching with people that were 60, 50, 40. Overall, it feels pretty bad. If you just got into Pool 3 and you're really struggling in the rank 40s and you're going up against a maxed out collection log Infinite player, it's really, really tough. And it can be discouraging. So I think we of course have to see how this plays out in practice, but overall it sounds like it's going to be a really positive change. And then another really welcomed one is that the weekly requirements have been reduced, but the rewards remain the same. So before it was 35 at the max tier, now the max tier is 25. So you can go with skipping a couple of days and you can still get that max tier, that max reward, and not feel so bad for missing a couple of missions here and there. And then something that is huge for me is they doubled the max number of decks. So from 10 to 20. So for me, with changing out decks, experimenting consistently, I had to delete a deck nearly every day. So the increase to 20 is very, very welcomed. I'm sure at some point I will get to the same, around the same position, but with 20, there's going to be several that I'm going to be able to part with without too much grief. I am going to skip down to the balance updates because the general updates were what I was excited about. The rest will be cool to see in practice, but the balance updates is where the meat of this update lies. So first up, we have an update to Artem Zola. So there's not any changes to the text or the card cost or power, but Artem Zola will no longer add copies of a card if the target was not destroyed. This means that you can't hide him behind an armor lane. You can't play into Wakanda where it's protected, where Artem Zola is not going to actually destroy the target, which was a way to cheese 3 of the same card out onto the board previously. I don't think this will impact him overall because it was such a niche interaction, but it is important to know this going into games if you are running Artem Zola. All right, so the first update that we have is one that I am really excited about. I think this is going to make this card pretty viable. So that is Baron Mordo. He went from on reveal, your opponent draws a card, increase its cost by 1. So on reveal, your opponent draws a card and then sets its cost to 6. This feels a lot more versatile. Of course, you can potentially get low roll, so maybe you allow them to draw into their onslaught and the cost remains the same, but you can also force them to draw into a Mjolnir. They could draw into a Sunspot, any of their other cards, and it becomes really difficult to play it to their curve or with their game plan. An Iron Man at 6 is a lot less desirable than on 5. Same thing with Professor X. There's a lot of good interruption with this card, and with him costing 2, I think he's gonna be pretty strong. I think this puts Baron Mordo in a really good spot, and this is one that I'm most excited about jumping in and trying out, is using a draw style deck now. I think it's going to be in a place where it is viable, whereas before it just felt really inconsistent and it didn't really do a lot. I think now it's going to force them to hold cards that they would have wanted to play otherwise. So next up we have Jessica Jones. Jessica Jones used to be a 5 cost 8 power card with an on reveal ability of if you don't play a card here next turn, plus 2 power. They have reduced the cost of her down to 4, very similar to what they did with Rescue. They reduced the power by half down to 4, and then gave you an additional incentive to fulfill the Honorville effect by doubling the power that it could potentially give. So whereas before it could potentially be a 5-cost 10 power card, now it can be a 4-cost 8 power card, and that's outside of like Camartage. I think that it gives you a little bit more play around potential. So my biggest issue with Jessica Jones at 5 cost was that it really telegraphed your final turn play. Whereas now you have an extra turn to kind of play around it. So you can drop it on 4, you can skip that lane on 5, you can still finish and potentially cap it out on 6 to push a little bit of extra power if you need it in that location. And then next up we have a nerf to Lady Sif. So she moved from a 2-cost 4 power card to a 3-cost 4 power card. Everything else stayed the same, but she did get increased in cost by 1, similar to what happened to Ghost Rider previously. Now I think this does a couple of things. Lady Sif was always really good with discard style decks because it always targeted your highest cost card, but the deck that I think this is going to hurt the most is an Agatha deck list. Agatha deck lists rely very heavily on either Wave or Lady Sif to discard them, and so now you have to always wait until turn 4 before you're able to regain control. So a lot of times you would have been able to regain control on 3, so that extra turn can be a huge impact in the long-term power potential for that play and for that deck. I think with this card, she'll find a spot still at 3 energy, and so I think she'll still see some play. It'll just be lesser so. It makes her a card or combo piece to pull off. And then next up we have Mr. Negative, probably one of the most anticipated or talked about nerfs of this upcoming patch. And so there was a lot of question of how do you nerf Mr. Negative? How do you nerf that power potential? So what they went with was reducing him from a 4-cost 4 power card down to a 4-cost 1 power card. His on-reel ability remains the same, so I think that he will still see a lot of play. This puts him in the realm of like a Sandman play, which with Sandman, losing that tempo is tough because it's hard to regain it after that. With Mr. Negative, and with the powerful cards and combos that he enables, I think that he'll still absolutely have a place in the meta and in the game. I don't know that there's very many times that the extra 3 power absolutely won me the game. It's nice to have to be able to disperse your power across the board, but I don't think that's really going to slow him down too much. It may dissuade a few people, but I think overall we'll still see a lot of Mr. Negative in the meta. And so for the next one, there's not much of a card text or power update, but they did do something pretty impactful that I think is going to be really important to know. So with Professor X previously, if a Hobgoblin, a Green Goblin was played on that same turn, the cards would change ownership. But now, once Professor X has been revealed, he now prohibits cards from changing ownership. That means if you happen to hit your opponent when they drop a Hobgoblin and you hit it with a Professor X in that lane, they're going to be stuck with that -8 power because it's not going to be able to switch sides. And then next up we have your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. So they increased his power by 1, so they did give him a buff, but overall I don't know that the additional 1 power is going to do a whole lot. His ability remains the same, but I think at 3 power the issue still becomes how do you regain that tempo. Yes, you can play in that lane on that following turn, so you can set up some good things, but I don't think necessarily the power push is going to make a huge difference here. And so next up, one that kind of surprised me was Thor. They gave him a slight buff in reducing his cost. They reduced his power by 2 as well, but Mjolnir's effect remains the same where it will give him +6 power, but you can drop Thor a turn earlier. So this is still going to be a really massive card. I think the energy reduction will allow more Thor combos outside of Jane Foster, but overall I thought Thor was in a good spot prior to the patch. And so I think we're going to see a lot of Thor in the upcoming weeks. Okay, next up we have Abomination, who moved from a 5-cost 8 power card to a 5-cost 9 power card. I don't know that this makes him feel necessarily viable in like Patriot decks or even just regular decks, but the extra power point is nice nonetheless. I don't know that it changes much of his play style or play percentage, but I think only time will tell if that extra energy will do a whole lot to benefit the Abomination. And then we have one that I think is pretty decent. We have Arrow, who increased from a 5-cost 6 power card to a 5-cost 8 power card. Her ability remains the same, so this is just a direct buff. And so if you were running arrow before, this now enables you to push a little bit of extra power while you're enabling some of those counter plays and that disruption for your opponent. And then we have Black Bolt. He increased from a 5 cost 7 power card to a 5 cost 8 power card. His effect remains the same. I don't think the extra power is really going to do much to help Black Bolt. With the extra power, I don't see Black Bolt being any better in any particular scenario than he was before. The extra 1 power is a little bit underwhelming because at 5 cost, a lot of times your opponent is going to have a lot of useless cards that they're not planning on playing at that point, such as rocks, low cost cards where they have higher priority cards that they want to drop first. And so at 5 cost, he feels pretty tough to use consistently. And so next up, we have a pretty juicy one. We have Blue Marvel. He went from a 6 cost 4 power card down to a 5 cost 3 power card. His ability remains the same. Your other cards have +1, but this enables you to do some pretty cool things. You can potentially do a Blue Marvel and an Onslaught combo. This allows him a lot more flexibility, and even if you're not going for an absolute high roll, this allows him to slot into a lot more decks a lot more consistently. And so I know before he was used in a lot of Mr. Negative decks, this actually makes him a little bit better because after he has been inversed, he will be 1 power cheaper and his ability remains the same, and it just pushes a little bit of power across the board and will be able to take your opponent off guard in certain scenarios. And then we have Devil Dino, which I'm not for sure how I feel about this one. Devil Dino was a 4 cost 0 power card. It is now a 5 cost 3 power card. The ability remains the same where it gets +2 power for each card in your hand, but it starts with 3 power. I think what this does is it prohibits it from being a staple in Mr. Negative decks. So we're going to have to get creative on the combo pieces that we use in a Mr. Negative list. But overall, if Devil Dino felt good before, I think he'll still feel good. The one exception is a Nick Fury build. So in my opinion, the list that Nick Fury feels the best in currently, or previously, was a Devil Dino shell where you mainly use his effect as a way to buff up your Devil Dino. At 5 cost, that's going to be a lot harder to pull off and going to be a lot less consistent. So I think we're going to see quite a bit less Devil Dino in the meta, but I'm sure it will still have a place in some deck lists. And then next up, we have a change to Gamora. So previously, Gamora was 5 cost, 6 power, and her owner availability was if your opponent played a card here this turn, +4 power. She has been given an additional power point, and she gets an additional power point from her owner availability as well. So if you are running something that runs an Odin, if you happen to be running this into Kamartaj, you can potentially create a lot larger Gamora quite a bit quicker. I think the extra power in both ways does make it feel a little bit more viable. So previously in one turn, the max power you could get with a Gamora without some kind of other enabling factor was 10 power. Now you can get a 5 cost 12 power, which is one of the better 5 cost cards. And honestly, I think this makes her feel pretty strong. This would be the same power level as a Hulk. Of course, you do have to play a card in the same lane that your opponent does, but a lot of times by that late in the game, you can pretty reasonably anticipate where that card play is going to be. And I think you're going to be able to hit the owner availability with this card a lot more often than you hit it with something like a Rocket or a lower cost card earlier in the game, where the plays are much more sporadic. I would anticipate seeing a lot more Gamora in the meta because I think that this puts her in a really powerful place. Even though it is a 5 cost card, I think the 12 power exchange is going to be pretty huge. And then next up we have Claw. So Claw used to be a 5 cost 4 power card with the ongoing ability. The location to the right has +5 power. This has been updated. His stat line stayed the same, but his ongoing ability got buffed by +1. So now the location to the right is going to have +6 power. And I feel like in deck lists that wanted to run Claw, Claw already performed pretty well. As a 5 cost 9 power push onto the board, I feel like he did his job decently. So this one did surprise me a little bit. Now it's going to be a 5 cost 10 power board presence, which is a lot more to deal with. And then you have other enablers that can either amplify or push or duplicate that ability to make that other lane pretty hard to compete with. And then next up we have Red Skull. He went from a 5 cost 14 power to a 5 cost 15 power. His ongoing ability remains the same. I think the one additional power is, to me, a little bit surprising. He already had a pretty big board presence, but if you look at it just at face value, if the opponent had a maxed out lane, we were giving them 8 power with our ongoing ability. And so overall for 5 costs, he was ending up being a 6 power presence. Now he's a 7 power presence, which even if they get the upside from the ongoing ability, is pretty huge. I think this makes him feel just a little bit better. It enables lists to essentially keep his ongoing ability We could run an Enchantress to destroy it at the end of the game. We could run Venom to destroy it. There's a lot of play around potential with Red Skull already, and I think the extra power may put him in a pretty decent spot. And then next up, we have one of the biggest card changes that honestly came as a surprise to me. Ronin used to be a 4-cost, 0-power card, ongoing +2 power for each card in your opponent's hand. This was in line with a Devil Dino, but now they differentiate themselves a little bit. Ronin was increased from 4 cost to 5. His power remains at 0, so he is still viable in a Mr. Negative list, but his ongoing ability is stronger. So it now has the ongoing ability +3 power for each card in your opponent's hand. I'm really interested to see this either in a Mr. Negative list or even just a draw list that uses something like Baron Mordo, Maximus, maybe even Black Widow to force them to have a card on the last turn. You could run Ronin and Mystique, and at +3 power for each card, if they get stuck with 5 cards in their hand, that is going to be a 15 power card, which is really, really big. And so I think this further punishes Devil Dino players, and I think this feels really, really strong. This is one of the cards that I am going to keep an eye out for because I think this could potentially be the next polarizing card. I think with this change, he has so much power potential. You could run things like Sandman and then drop him. That regains the power tempo that you lost by dropping Sandman on 4. You could run him in a Mr. Negative list. And this could be ambitious, but I think this is the card for this patch or for this meta. And then next up we have Spider-Woman. Spider-Woman was a 4-cost, 4-power card. She is now a 5-cost, 7-power card. So before, her maximum board presence was 8 power. Now with 5 cost and 7 power, she could potentially push 11 power onto the lane if she is used in a lane that the opponent has capped out, which I think makes her feel okay, but I also think this also makes her run into the issue of costing potentially too much. So in the Give 'em Crap or Junk deck that she was often most commonly used in, one of my favorite combos was dropping Hazmat and then dropping her on turn 6 at the same time. That now becomes a little bit tougher. You would have to extend the game with magic to be able to potentially do that, and even then it still feels pretty tough to pull off. So I am interested if we see just more general play out of Spider-Woman in this meta. So I could see this in a deck that runs an Odin anyways, so maybe she fills the slot of Jane Foster if it turns out that being able to drop Thor on turn 3 instead of turn 4 allows us to more consistently draw into Mjolnir naturally. Maybe she takes the spot of Jane Foster in those lists, because we'd be able to potentially trigger her again with Odin and make a really big board presence as a result. Next up we have Agatha. She increased from 13 power to 14, just a little bit of a buff, but with the change to Lady Sif, I don't think this buff is going to be enough to help her in a lot of situations. We have a stat line increase for Hulk from an 11 power card to a 12 power card. Overall, I think this makes him more in line with a Magneto without the potential disruption impact. Onslaught was increased from a 6 power card to a 7 power card. I don't think this changes Onslaught or his core decks very much. And then we have Spectrum. She was buffed from a 4 power card to a 5 power card. Her own revealability remains the same, and similar to Onslaught, I don't know that this change makes her any more or less viable outside of the decks that she was already good in. This just makes it a little bit extra power push, but the 1 power compared to like a double trigger of Spectrum into ongoing cards, in the long run, I don't think will impact her too much. And then we have a much wanted and asked for update to Ultron. Previously, Ultron's own availability was create 4 1-power drones in each adjacent location. And so this was very similar to a Mr. Fantastic, where you had to play him into mid if you wanted to impact both other lanes. This has now been changed to be more in line with like a Dr. Doom, where on reveal create 4 1-power drones at each other location. This is going to allow for a little bit more flexibility in where you play a Patriot deck that is running an Ultron. Okay, so jumping over into some of the bug fixes, the one that stands out the most to me, a lot of these are pretty standard bug fixes, but Wong's ability now functions correctly with Onslaught if Onslaught is played after Wong. This makes the Exodia combo much more consistent, because before you would have to jump through a lot of hoops to play Onslaught first, and then you would have to have Mystique, and then finally your Wong. But now you can play Wong, Onslaught, you can play Mystique, and then plus a final card on the last turn. To enable that combo much more consistently. It still gets countered by the same things. I think this is going to make it quite a bit more consistent, and I'm excited to jump in and try out some Exodia combos and deck lists to see how consistent I can make it. Another one that I think is pretty cool is the Honorville effects triggered by Odin are now doubled by Kamartaj. So now each are going to trigger 4 times if you play an Odin, which is going to make for some absolutely insane types of games, and I'm so excited to see some of the crazy potential that this enables. And so another one that I think is really good for a lot of players is pasting a deck if you do not own all of the cards will now create a deck with the cards you do own for that copied deck. So previously you had to own every single piece that was in the deck code that you copied. This enables a lot more flexibility to freely share those deck lists to others to be able to copy and paste what they do have, and then they can adjust from there, which is a lot more user-friendly than manually putting in every single card. All right, and I know that that was a lengthy update, and so I appreciate you guys bearing with me through it all. Please let me know what you think of these kind of patch review style videos, what you think I should focus more on, what you think I should kind of streamline so that I can continue to improve these moving forward. What do you think of the patch overall? I think there were a lot of expected or really needed balances, but at the same time, some that I thought were going to be core, something like a Magic or a Sarah, were not included in this list, and then others that I wasn't anticipating at all, such as the Devil Dino and the Ronin, completely caught me by surprise. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I hope that you guys enjoyed the video. This has been TLSG. Later, guys.